Section 61 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 4, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 8, Chapter 16, Part 1, Spheres of Action, Miscellaneous Business. In the undefined and widely extending jurisdiction of the Inquisition, there were a number of matters more or less connected with the faith, of which it assumed cognizance. Their cursory consideration is indispensable, and they can more conveniently be grouped together. Marriage in orders. The celibacy enjoined on the Catholic clergy includes the seculars, from the subdiaconate upwards, and the regulars who were bound by the 3 vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. Even degradation from orders does not remove the disability, as the indelible character impressed in the ordination remains. Strict as has been the enforcement of the canons, since the 12th century the weakness of the flesh has at all times led to occasional infractions of the rule, punishable with degradation, reclusion in a monastery, and other penalties. Whether the offence was justiciable by the Inquisition was, in the earlier period, the subject of debate, some authors holding that if the marriage was public it implied heretical error, bringing it under inquisitorial jurisdiction, but that if it was secret this showed that there was no intellectual misbelief, making the offender guilty only of violating the law, and subjecting him, if secular, to the spiritual courts, and if regular, to the prelates of his order. The Reformation, which sanctioned clerical marriage, introduced a new and controlling factor that in time altered the situation. Yet for a considerable period there was a powerful movement, especially among German Catholics, to relax the prohibition in the hope of effecting a reunion. The question was regarded as open for discussion, as a matter merely of discipline. Arnaldo Albertino argues that the Pope can dispense for marriage in orders, and instances the dispensation granted by Alexander VI to his son Caesar Borgia, then a cardinal deacon, to marry the heiress of Valentinois. The reactionary influences which controlled the Council of Trent changed all this when, in 1563, it made clerical celibacy a matter of faith, rendering priestly marriage unquestionably thenceforth heretical. The Inquisition, however, did not wait for this to assume jurisdiction, though it seems not to have acted until after the outbreak of the Reformation had rendered clerical celibacy a subject of discussion. The earliest case that I have met is that of Miguel Gomez, a priest of Saragossa, sentenced for marrying in orders by the Toledo tribunal in 1529, when the peculiar punishment would seem to show that it was a novelty for which no precedent existed. He was exhibited for 3 days on a ladder at the portal of the cathedral in his shirt and drawers, with his hands tied, his feet chained, and a mitre on his head, after which he was deprived for life of sacerdotal functions, and banished forever from the province. Toledo had no other case until 1562, when it had to deal with the somewhat complicated offence of Fray Juan Ramirez, who entered a religious order while married, but twice left it and returned again, during which performances he married 2 wives. That jurisdiction depended wholly on the sacrament is seen in the case of Juan Carrillo, alias Fray Juan Ortiz, a Franciscan denounced in 1596 to the Toledo tribunal by his prelate, Fray Juan de Ovando, for apostasy and living with a woman reputed to be his wife. Investigation showed that she was merely his concubine, so the case was suspended, and he was remanded to Ovando to be dealt with under the rules of the order. After the offence had clearly been made heresy by the Council of Trent, the terrifying formula of accusation by the fiscal describes the offender as unworthy of mercy, to be deprived of all ecclesiastical privilege, to be degraded from his orders, and to be relaxed to the secular arm, to which was added the atroci demanding the free use of torture. In practice, however, there was the widest discretion. It is true that writers speak of appearance in public, auto or degradation, and reclusion in a monastery for years, or a similar term of galley service, but there seems to have been no rule. Indeed, it is not easy to understand how an offence so uniform in its nature should have been visited with penalties so diverse. In 1597, Francisco Agustin, an Augustinian of Barcelona, married in Toledo, sought to defend himself on the plea that he had entered the order under compulsion in order to escape his debts, his sentence was appearance in an auto, abjuration de levi, and imprisonment for life in the convent where he had made profession. In 1629, Fray Lorenzo de Avalle, a Benedictine priest, accused himself to the Valladolid tribunal of having married and lived for 8 years as a musician in Aragon. Notwithstanding his self-denunciation, he was sentenced to verbal degradation and to 4 years' detention in a monastery, where he was to undergo a circular discipline, while the woman was notified that she was free to marry again. In strong contrast with this was the case of Juan Alonso Palacios, a married Jesuit, before the Toledo tribunal in 1659, who, though not an espontaneado, escaped with a reprimand and 4 years of reclusion. Then, in 1664, Fray Juan de Ayala, a Mercenarian priest, was, by the same tribunal, suspended perpetually from his functions and recluded for 3 years in a convent with 1 year's Friday fasting and some spiritual penance. Again, in 1675, the same tribunal condemned Jeronimo de Morales, a married subdeacon, to 5 years in the galleys, 3 more of exile, and disqualification for orders. 5 years of galleys, with 3 more of exile and deprivation of functions and benefices, was the portion of Don Cristoval de Zabiati, alias Don Juan Baptista de Verganza, priest of Talavera de la Reina, who appeared in the Great Madrid auto of 1680. In 1700, the Toledo tribunal had to deal with a case characterized as con circunstancias gravísimas, so that we may regard the sentence as representing the extremity of punishment for the offence. The culprit was not required to appear in an auto, but his sentence was read in the audience chamber in the presence of 24 ecclesiastics. It prescribed abjuration de levi, perpetual deprivation of functions, perpetual confinement in a convent cell, to be left only for choir and refectory, in which he was to have the last place, to fasting for 4 years on bread and water on Fridays and vigils, and to a circular discipline when taken to the convent. The details of his career are not given, but there is a suggestion of material for a picaresque novel, as the culprit was a Dominican, Fray Tomas Juster, who had been a calificador of the Inquisition and a preacher of the king, and who enjoyed the multifarious aliases of Don Juan de San Feliu Cisneros, Don Vicente de Ochaita, and Don Juan de Ibarrola. It is somewhat remarkable that degradation appears so rarely to be resorted to. The offence seems to have been by no means frequent. In the Toledo reports from 1575 to 1610 there are only the 2 cases referred to above, and in the record from the same tribunal from 1648 to 1794 the number is only 10. From 1780 to 1820 the combined records of all the tribunals show only 6 cases. End of section 61.